I put out a video recently called Stop Limiting Your Masters, which covers how mastering could be performed without limiters, and why it should if your goal is to preserve transients as much as possible. Now, some folks liked it and some didn't, but people agreed that they wanted to see it applied in a mastering chain. So let's cover mastering without limiters, alternatives for achieving loudness. I'll create a mastering chain as I introduce maximization instead of limiting, and show the step-by-step process in case you want to try it for yourself. Also, I'll show when this method works well, when it may be more trouble than it's worth, and of course, provide demos of multiple genres mastered with this technique so you can judge for yourself. First, let's check out an A-B mastering chain, both mastered to -8 LUFS. One is mastered with maximization, and the other is mastered with the Pro L2, set using its modern algorithm. Now, of course, using one limiter isn't how most people would master, but I want to show how I'm able to reach about -8 LUFS with maximization and saturation spread amongst multiple processors. Now, this level is a little bit high in my opinion, but this is for the sake of just showing it can be done. By the end of this particular chain, maximization causes about 1.5 to 2 dB of attenuation to the peaks and uses gradual attenuation when it does compress. Meanwhile, limiting alone would necessitate up to 7.5 dB of attenuation for this particular mix.
She reminds me of a cold dark summer's night when I'm staring at the lights and I'm hoping that there could be something more here, but she's looking the other way and I'm wishing I could be something that she could hold on to, but tonight here.
So let's cover creating a chain without limiters part 1. Mastering without brick wall limiters isn't too difficult. First, it helps to know that the majority of maximizers begin to compress more heavily around the -2 to -1 dB mark. So it helps to start off with your peaks around this level. This way you're not amplifying peaks into the ceiling like you would with a limiter. Instead, the low-level signals are the majority of what's being amplified, while the peaks are affected to a lesser extent. Maximization does impart harmonic distortion, more so than limiting, but that does depend heavily on the processor that you're using. Now, this is why I recommend the Pro C2 due to its mastering algorithm. By blending the wet and the dry dials and having auto makeup gain off, which is important, I get a lot of control over the low amplitude aspects of the track. By adjusting the threshold, I can determine the exact range that's amplified, and with the mastering algorithm, I can ensure that distortion is kept at very low levels. Due to how much control it gives me and how minimal the distortion is, I can rely on this processor somewhat heavily. In this chain, I set the threshold to -30 dB and used a soft knee, meaning everything below -30 dB is amplified a fair amount, while the amplification occurs to higher amplitudes to a lesser extent. Now, how you process is, of course, up to you, but I wanted to show what I'm doing here for the sake of transparency. Then, I chose to use this Omnipressor plugin. Just inserting the plugin maximizes lower amplitudes by about 5 dB. Then, with a 1.1 to 1 ratio and only 0.5 dB of range in either direction, I can compress the signal when it's above my threshold and amplify it when it's below. This very subtle control of the peaks and the signal below the peaks evens out the dynamics a little bit. Next up, I inserted the Weiss MM1 set to about 40%. Now, in the future, I might not use this processor. It's really not doing too much, even at this high of a level, but I built it into the chain here, so I'm a little hesitant to change it, and at least the effect is just about distortion-free. Now, notice how no peak attenuation is occurring with this plugin, and that the limiter isn't engaged. Next, the PSP Vintage Warmer is used for its knee function. The drive acts more like a limiter, but the knee amplifies quieter details before very gradually compressing higher amplitudes. Now, if you use this plugin, I recommend introducing oversampling, which is called FAT on this plugin, not sure why. Also, the multiband setting is super helpful since it allows for band-specific release times. So, if you notice that the highs and the peaks are getting a little lost, you could reduce the release time to help return them to unity more quickly. Now, a quicker release for higher frequencies shouldn't cause more distortion, but it would for lower frequencies, so just be careful with that. At the end of tweaking the settings, I'm getting about 0.5 to 1 dB of attenuation. So far we've introduced mild harmonic distortion with our 4 processors and attenuated the peaks by 1.5 dB at most. The other 3 processors won't attenuate the peaks any further, but I'll discuss those in a moment. However, the loudness has increased from -16 LUFS to -10.5 LUFS already. So let's listen to these processors enabled one at a time so we can hear how they're collectively pushing quieter details forward. Next up, let's cover creating a chain without limiters part 2. So instead of relying solely on maximization, harmonic distortion could be used to increase perceived loudness. Generating harmonics fills the gaps in the frequency response, and it amplifies musical frequencies already present in the mix and arrangement. The ozone exciter is a good option. I'll use subtle settings that work well for each band. It's really not doing too much, but after trying it and comparing it to Saturn II, I enjoyed how it brings some of the percussive elements forward. Lastly, the Oxford Inflator and the Oxford Limiter both offer great maximization options. The inflator is arguably more aggressive, with higher levels of distortion, and the limiter's enhance function is subtle, but it's noticeable nonetheless. Now, the inflator's metering makes it look like significant amplification is occurring, but it's only amplifying by about 1 dB with these settings. Also, a slightly positive curve value prioritizes maximization over harmonic distortion with this plugin. Lastly, we have the Oxford Limiter's enhance function, set more aggressively, but again, the effect is pretty subtle. Now, as you can see, I'm not attenuating the peaks, just amplifying lower amplitude levels. So all in all, the goal here isn't to change the mix all that much. It's an attempt to find the most subtle wave shaping possible to bring up quieter details while leaving peaks alone as much as possible. Now, the processors shouldn't alter the frequency response aside from the effect of harmonic distortion, with the exception of the PSP Vintage Warmer, which amplifies the lows slightly. The harmonic distortion caused by maximization can definitely be a problem to some, but it's pretty comparable to the Pro L2 unless you're using a lot of look ahead. The gain of the limiter is cleaner for sure, but that's just because it's basically the same as increasing a fader's level or the clip gain. The brick wall limiting itself will cause harmonic distortion, similar to how a maximizer's wave shaping causes harmonic distortion. I'll cover other genres in just a moment, some pros and cons of the method and so on, but let's take an extended listen to the chain-enabled, one plugin at a time. Feel free to skip ahead if you'd like.
She reminds me of a cold, dark summer's night when I'm staring at the lights, and I'm hoping that there could be something more here, but she's looking the other way, and I'm wishing I could be something that she could hold on to, but tonight here. She reminds me of a cold, dark summer's night when I'm staring at the lights, and I'm hoping that there could be something more here, but she's looking the other way, and I'm wishing I could be something that she could hold on to, but tonight here.
Make mixes that accurately translate what you hear in your head without years of practice or expensive plugins. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy Award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy Award-winning artist Toulis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Why waste your time creating mixes that look like this when you can instantly fix the problem by working directly with professionals who have already done what you're trying to do? Watch this entire video, and at the end, learn how you can start making mixes that accurately translate what you hear in your head. Next up, let's cover maximization and various genres. Now, one of the biggest concerns that I saw with the last video is how something like this would work for EDM, which makes a lot of sense. A big part of the sound is aggressive loudness mixed with distortion to peaks. That said, a clipper is probably a better option than a limiter if that's the goal, since the more aggressive distortion makes up for some of what's lost from transients when they're truncated. However, I was surprised by how well this method works for the genre. Now, some of the quintessential distortion is definitely gone, but overall, it's an enjoyable sound. It's probably not an option if you want -5 LUFS masters or something like that, but if anything, combining this method with limiting or clipping could likely help most EDM engineers reach louder levels without the need for attenuating peaks as significantly. I'll tweak some settings of the chain to work with this EDM mix that I have here, but I'll keep everything just about the same. With some more aggressive settings, I got it to about -6.5 LUFS with maximization. Again, I'll match it as closely as possible to the limiter's loudness, and as you can imagine, by the nature of how it works, the limiter required a lot more attenuation comparatively. Next up, let's cover high dynamic ranges and the problems they cause. So when mastering hip-hop, I ran into the first big issue with this method. No matter how much I tweaked the settings, I couldn't get it above -10 LUFS before I didn't enjoy the sound anymore. That said, I did notice that this hip-hop mix has the greatest dynamic range, meaning it takes a lot more processing to push up quieter details to close to peak level. However, this could probably be said for any highly dynamic track, whether it's maximization or limiting. The more dynamic, the more peak attenuation you'd need to reach a higher LUFS if you were limiting, and the more amplification you'd need to boost lower levels when you're maximizing. Now, to me, this indicates that a properly controlled mix is the most important element if you want to avoid significant processing regardless of the method. Still, to my ear, limiting sounded better in this instance when set to similar loudnesses. So, let's compare maximization with limiting for this particular hip-hop track.
From the window to the wall, we getting lit up in it, bouncing. We does it big up in it. From the window to the wall, we getting lit up in it, bouncing. We does it big up in it.
So after testing this method a bit more, I'm still confident it could be used to replace brick wall limiting, even if we're trying to achieve a high LUFS. Now, although it imparts more distortion, I didn't find this to be too big of an issue since various methods and processors offer cleaner ways to maximize. This method isn't suited for reaching extreme LUFS levels, but I imagine it could be used in combination with limiting or clipping to reach those levels without as much peak attenuation as limiting would have alone. That said, just like limiting, if you don't mind the distortion and you care about the loudness a lot, you could push these processors much more aggressively than I did here. In the end, some additional refinement for this method is needed, but I'm excited to see how maximization could be used to circumvent limiting as processors improve. As to whether or not you should stop limiting and use this method instead, that's of course up to you, but I imagine if more people try it and share their findings, we'll find some cool ways to improve it. But these are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments. Make mixes that accurately translate what you hear in your head, without years of practice or expensive plugins. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy award-winning artist Toulis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Why waste your time creating mixes that look like this when you can instantly fix the problem by clicking the link in the description and working directly with professionals who have already done what you're trying to do? We've helped 2,346 clients make mixes that accurately translate what they hear in their heads without years of practice or expensive plugins, and it'll work for you too. Click the link in the description and get direct access to us for custom analog mastering, one-on-one mixing feedback, in-depth mixing and mastering courses, and our thriving community. Click the link in the description now to start making mixes that accurately translate what you hear in your head.